So what would happen if Russia and Ukraine ended their war and signed a peace treaty? This may still seem as a distant prospect right now, but no war lasts forever, so it is inevitable and will happen at some point. So today I'll examine the economic, political and social consequences of a potential peace agreement if it were to happen, say, tomorrow. And I will also focus on whether reconciliation between these two nations and their people is even possible long-term. So let's begin. First up is the economy. A peace treaty would mark a turning point for the economies of both Ukraine and Russia, which were each battered by the war in distinct ways. For Ukraine, the economic devastation is quite profound. By 2024, the World Bank estimated that rebuilding Ukraine's infrastructure, like ports, power plants, roads and homes, could cost upwards of $500 billion. The war has obliterated nearly half of Ukraine's energy capacity and disrupted its agricultural exports, which has been a cornerstone of its pre-war economy. So, a peace agreement would likely unlock significant international aid with the European Union, United States, and multilateral institutions like the IMF, which would pledge billions for reconstruction, which would restore access to Black Sea ports, which are currently hampered by Russian blockades, and that would revive Ukraine's grain trade, easing global food price pressures and injecting some revenue into Ukraine's economy. However, recovery won't be straightforward. Ukraine's history of corruption could hinder the transparent allocation of aid, as was seen in pre-war governance challenges. And industrial regions like Donbass, which are rich in coal and minerals, face long-term disruption, especially if territorial disputes persist. A peace deal might include economic concessions such as joint resource management in contested areas, but Ukraine's growing alignment with the EU, which is evidenced by its 2022 candidacy status, suggests a westward pivot that could limit reliance on Russian markets. Foreign investment like the 2025 US-Ukraine minerals deal may boost growth but risks tying Ukraine's resources to Western interests, potentially constraining its economic autonomy. For Russia, the war has strained the economy under pressure from Western sanctions. By 2025, sanctions have slashed Russia's GDP by an estimated 10 to 15% and also disrupted energy exports and triggered capital flight. A peace treaty could bring partial sanctions relief, particularly if Russia withdraws from some of the occupied territories. This would allow Moscow to resume some trade with Europe, though the EU's shift to alternative energy sources limits Russia's leverage in that space, and investor confidence is still quite shaky. The war has also accelerated Russia's brain drain, with thousands of skilled workers fleeing conscription or repression, and technological isolation has hampered innovation in the economy. A peace deal might redirect military spending to civilian needs, but without structural reform, which is unlikely under Putin's centralized control, Russia risks a long-term stagnation. The economic interdependence between Russia and Ukraine, which was once significant through Soviet-era supply chains, is unlikely to recover. Ukraine's reorientation towards the EU and Russia's deepening ties with China and India point to divergent paths. A peace treaty could stabilize both economies, but the benefits will depend on the terms, whether they prioritize reparations, trade restoration, or maybe mutual investment. And, of course, the political will to implement them in the first place. And that brings us to politics. A peace treaty would reshape the domestic and international dynamics for both nations. For Ukraine, the core issues are territorial integrity and security. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has consistently demanded Russia's full withdrawal from all occupied territories, including Crimea and Donbass, as a non-negotiable condition. Russia, however, has signaled in 2025 that it expects recognition of its territorial gains. A compromise might involve Ukraine temporarily ceding control of some areas in exchange for security guarantees or accelerated EU and NATO integration. Such a deal would align with Ukraine's westward shift, but could spark domestic backlash. Nationalists and war-weary citizens might view territorial concessions as betrayal, threatening Zelenskyy's government or fueling unrest within the country. Security guarantees are equally contentious. Ukraine seeks binding commitments from Western powers, potentially including NATO membership or multilateral defense pacts. Russia's demand for a veto over such arrangements, as was seen in 2022 talks, remains a major obstacle to this path. There is also a chance that a peace treaty might establish a demilitarized zone, which would be monitored by international peacekeepers, potentially up to 100,000 troops, according to some analysts, which would enforce a ceasefire. However, without NATO membership, which faces resistance from countries like Hungary and skeptical US lawmakers, Ukraine could remain vulnerable to future aggression. And in this regard, the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons for security assurances, looms as a cautionary tale of broken promises. And then, in Russia, the political impact depends on how the Kremlin spins the treaty. Putin has framed the war as defense against Western encroachment, tying his legitimacy to its success. A deal securing territorial gains or Ukraine's neutrality could be presented as a victory, strengthening his regime. In contrast, withdrawing without significant concessions risks exposing cracks in his authority. Public dissent, even though suppressed, has grown, with underground polls in 2022 showing a minority in urban centers questioning the war's justification. A peace treaty might ease economic pressures, but Putin's reliance on censorship and propaganda limits political openness, which stifles the debate about the true costs of the war. And globally, a peace treaty would ripple across alliances. NATO's cohesion, which was bolstered by Finland and Sweden's 2022 memberships, could be tested if the deal appears to reward Russian aggression. Authoritarian regimes might feel emboldened, while the global south, where Russia has gained influence through disinformation, could see peace as a step towards a multipolar world. China, which is Russia's key economic partner, could play a pivotal role, either pressuring Moscow to negotiating or leveraging the outcome to expand its influence. The treaty's terms, whether they prioritize justice, deterrence, or pragmatism, will shape the global order for decades to come. And next, the social consequences of a peace treaty are deeply human, touching on loss, displacement, and identity. In Ukraine, the war has displaced over 8 million people abroad and millions more internally, while tens of thousands have died. A peace treaty could enable some refugees to return, but rebuilding communities will again take decades. The war has forged a stronger Ukrainian identity, but at the same time widening the cultural gulf with Russia, especially after atrocities like Bucha massacre and the forced deportation of Ukrainian children. Social cohesion will hinge on addressing these traumas through war crime trials, veteran support, and repatriation efforts, while avoiding internal divisions over peace terms. And in Russia, the war has polarized society, though state control obscures the extent of this division. Propaganda has framed Ukraine as a fascist threat, resonating with some but alienating the others, particularly younger urban Russians who have access to uncensored information. The war's toll of hundreds of thousands of casualties and forced conscription has bred quiet resentment, which is evident in drought dodging and immigration spikes. A peace treaty could reduce some social strain, but Russia's tightly controlled media environment stifles open reckoning with the consequences of the war. Without space for public reflection, social healing does not seem probable. And then there is the hatred between Russians and Ukrainians, which has deep roots in the war's brutality. Russian disinformation has dehumanized Ukrainians, while Ukraine's anger over invasions, from Crimea in 2014 to the big one in February 2022, has hardened anti-Russian sentiment. Cultural ties like shared language, history and religion have frayed. And then you see Ukraine's derussification efforts, like removing Russian monuments, which reflects a broader rejection of Russian influence. This mutual animosity, fueled by trauma and propaganda, is the greatest barrier to reconciliation. And that's why now we confront the central question: can people of Russia and Ukraine overcome the hatred that this war has entrenched? And if so, when might this happen, and what could help? You see, the hatred is visceral and mutual. In Ukraine, Russia's actions like bombings, abductions and cultural erasure have left wounds that may take generations to heal. over 80% of Ukrainians view Russia as an enemy, which is a sharp rise from pre-war years. In Russia, state's media portrayal of Ukraine as a Western puppet has taken hold among many. Dissent still exists, but it's feeble because all the main critics ended up jailed or dead, sometimes both. These narratives, reinforced by propaganda and personal loss, make reconciliation seem a very distant prospect. Yet history shows that even bitter enemies can reconcile. Post-World War II Europe is a prime example. Germany and France, after centuries of conflict, built trust through economic cooperation, starting with the 1951 European Coal and Steel Community. By 1963, their leaders signed the Friendship Treaty, which was unthinkable a generation earlier. Similarly, Poland and Germany overcame wartime hatred through youth exchanges, joint education and truth commissions. These cases suggest that reconciliation is possible, but they require political will, economic incentives, and decades of concentrated effort. Now, for Russia and Ukraine, reconciliation is unlikely in the near term. A peace treaty, if it was to happen in 2025 or soon after, might halt violence, but trust building would take way longer. The first decade post-peace would likely focus on practical steps, like repatriating prisoners and abducted Ukrainian children, as demanded by Kyiv in 2022 talks. And this could be a humanitarian starting point. Of course, international tribunals for war crimes would be a good step forward because they would signal accountability. However, Russia's denials of atrocities complicates justice. Without Russian acknowledgement of responsibility, as Germany did post-1945, it will be hard for Ukrainians to forgive Russia for generations to come. Still, by the 2030s, grassroots effort could gain traction if supported by neutral mediators like the UN or countries like Turkey. Cultural exchanges like those that happened between German and Polish students could humanize the other, but they would need safe, propaganda-free spaces. Social media, despite its many risks, could facilitate dialogue, as has been seen in small Russian and Ukrainian online forums. Education reform is also critical. Ukraine must avoid vilifying all Russians, while Russia needs a curricula that confronts its imperialist past, which is a tall order under current censorship. However, the 2040s and beyond offer more hope. As younger generations less tied to Soviet nostalgia or wartime trauma come of age, things may finally start changing. Economic cooperation, perhaps through neutral trade zones, could create shared interest, though Ukraine's EU integration makes this a little complicated. South Africa's post-apartheid model, where storytelling bridged divides, suggests that community dialogues could help, but only if both governments endorse them. External support, like funding from the EU or NGOs or diaspora communities, could sustain these efforts too. Of course, it would help a lot if Russia's information control was loosened somewhat, but it is a distant prospect while Putin is in power or if there is a similar leadership in Russia. Ukraine's democratic openness offers more room for civil society, but it must also balance justice with inclusivity to avoid alienating ethnic Russians. And then international pressure like sanctions tied to reconciliation benchmarks could also incentivize progress. So, of course, there are chances of overcoming this hate, perhaps 20 to 30% within a generation, based on some historical parallels. But it requires sustained commitment. Without it, resentment could linger for decades. Just look at the Balkans post-1990s. So, a peace treaty between Russia and Ukraine would reshape their economies and their politics and societies, offering a chance to rebuild what has been lost. But overcoming the hatred between the people is the greatest challenge, one that demands truth, justice, and most of all, time. It may take decades, perhaps the 2040s or beyond, for reconciliation to really take root, but history shows that it's possible with the right steps, such as accountability, dialogue, and a shared vision of peace. As we look to the future, let's hope for a day when Russians and Ukrainians can see each other not as enemies, but again as neighbors. And then, what do you think? What will it take for Russia and Ukraine to heal from this? And when do you think that peace may finally be achieved? Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this video to be interesting or thought-provoking, please leave a like and subscribe for more. Thank you very much for watching, stay curious, stay critical, and I'll see you on the next one.